The autumn wind of 1879 cut across Wyoming territory, like a blade seeking flesh, carrying the bitter scent of dying grass and the promise of winter's merciless embrace. Leonora Zimmerman stepped down from the freight wagon, on legs that trembled with exhaustion and something deeper, a growing certainty that the gentle letters from Heinrich Müller had led her into a trap from which there might be no escape. At 22, she had imagined America as a land where hard work and honest dreams could flourish. Instead, she found herself surrounded by men whose eyes held a hunger that made her stomach turn with instinctive dread. Her blue dress, once carefully pressed for this momentous arrival, now hung torn and stained after weeks of brutal travel across an unforgiving continent. Greasy Pete, whose beard seemed to catalog every meal he'd consumed in recent memory, spat a stream of tobacco juice that splattered near her worn boots. "There's your German rose, boys. Still got some prettiness left, but we'll fix that soon enough." The crude laughter that followed sent panic racing through Leonora's chest. This was nothing like Heinrich's letters had promised. No kind shopkeeper waited to greet her. No comfortable parlor beckoned with civilized warmth. Only these rough strangers surrounded her, their voices growing bolder as they sensed her vulnerability. Without conscious thought, she gathered her skirts and fled toward the cottonwood trees beyond the settlement's edge. Behind her, their mockery grew louder, as if her terror provided the finest entertainment they'd enjoyed in weeks. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs betrayed her, sending her tumbling among fallen leaves and scattered stones. The agony that had plagued her for days during the wagon journey flared with renewed intensity, an intimate suffering born of poor conditions and the relentless jolting over rough terrain. But there were no words in English for such feminine distress, no way to explain to strangers the fire that consumed her from within. Through tears of frustration and fear, she became aware of another presence among the trees. A Cheyenne warrior stood in the dappled shadows, perhaps 55 years of age, with silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines carved by wind and hardship. Scars marked his shoulders like a map of survival, while his left arm held a subtle stiffness that spoke of old wounds never fully healed. Hayamovi wore traditional buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and upon his head sat a ceremonial bonnet with eagle feathers that caught the filtered sunlight. In his weathered hands, he held a smooth river stone worn by countless floods into perfect symmetry. He had come to honor his nephew, a bright boy of 12, who had drowned when Ash River ran wild with spring snowmelt. Each month since that terrible day, Hayamovi returned to leave a stone in remembrance, following traditions that connected him to generations of ancestors. The ritual brought no peace, but it kept memory alive. The sight of the young woman's distress stirred something in his chest, not desire but the deep instinct to protect the vulnerable that had guided him through 5 decades of survival. His own daughter had been 28 when she died. Beautiful Singing Bird burned in a raid that still haunted his dreams. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. When he knelt at a respectful distance, his voice carried the careful English learned from years of necessity. "You hurt," he said simply. Desperation overwhelmed modesty. The agony had become unbearable, and this stranger's quiet dignity offered the first kindness she'd encountered since leaving Hamburg. In a whisper barely audible above the wind, she confessed her suffering. "I've been in terrible pain. Down there." She breathed, her face burning with shame. "The journey. I think something's very wrong." Hayamovi neither flinched nor turned away. He had witnessed much suffering, battlefield wounds, childhood diseases, the slow death of his people's way of life. Pain recognized no boundaries of race or culture. He extended his hands, palms upward, helping her to her feet with touches to her elbows only. "I hear," he said in his steady voice. And somehow those simple words carried more comfort than all of Heinrich's flowery promises. As he guided her toward town, a rifle shot cracked to the morning air. Greasy Pete had followed his weapon, aimed in their direction, while his face twisted with malice. Get back from that girl, you red devil. She belongs to Mr. Voss now. Hayamovi moved without hesitation, placing himself between Leonora and the threat. His own rifle appeared with practiced ease, but before violence could erupt, Dr. Edwin Pike emerged from his clinic like an avenging angel, shotgun in hand and fury blazing in his eyes. "Lower that weapon, Pete, or I'll scatter you across 3 counties," the physician roared. "This woman needs medical attention, not your drunken theatrics." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge until Pete finally spat and retreated. But his pale eyes promised this was far from over. As they helped Leonora toward the clinic, she caught sight of Hayamovi's scarred hands and the careful way he moved his wounded shoulder. Here was a man who understood suffering, who carried his own hidden wounds with quiet dignity. For the first time since stepping off that wagon, Leonora Zimmerman was no longer completely alone. Dr. Pike's clinic occupied a converted storefront, its shelves lined with bottles of carbolic acid laudanum and the basic remedies that kept frontier folk alive. The examination confirmed what her tortured body had been screaming: a severe infection caused by inadequate hygiene during the wagon journey, aggravated by constant jolting and the complete absence of proper facilities. "Treatable, but you'll need complete rest," Pike assured her as he prepared hot compresses. "Twice daily cleansing with carbolic solution laudanum for the worst pain, and no riding for at least a week." As he worked, Leonora's story emerged in halting English, mixed with German phrases. She had responded to newspaper advertisements in Hamburg's immigrant quarter, corresponding for months with Heinrich Müller, who claimed to own a prosperous dry goods store in Willow Springs. His letters had been gentle, respectful, promising partnership in both business and life. What she hadn't mentioned in her responses was the land deed her Uncle Klaus had pressed into her hands during his final illness. She'd regarded it as merely a family keepsake from his wandering surveyor days in America. Klaus Zimmermann had been a Civil War veteran who received a homestead grant under the 1862 Act. He'd worked briefly as a territorial surveyor before falling ill with pneumonia, always planning to return west, but never finding the right moment. On his deathbed, he'd pressed the deed into her hands with urgent intensity. "This may be worth more than you expect," he'd whispered. "Guard it well." What neither Leonora nor her dying uncle could have known was that Heinrich Müller didn't exist. The letters had been forgeries crafted by Armand Voss, a cattle and ore speculator, whose empire extended across much of the territory through calculation and violence. At 48, Voss had built his wealth by controlling what others needed most. His Copper Gulch mine required enormous quantities of water for processing silver ore, while his vast cattle ranches depended on reliable sources to survive periodic droughts. Water was power in this harsh land, and Voss had spent years acquiring every significant water right he could identify. The problem was Klaus Zimmermann's homestead deed, which included legal ownership of 80 acres surrounding Willow Springs, the only reliable water source within 50 miles. Voss had hired the old surveyor for mapping work, gradually extracting information about Klaus's American holdings. When the surveyor fell ill, Voss had visited his Hamburg boarding house under the pretense of charity, while actually probing for details about any inheritance. The Heinrich Müller deception had been designed to lure Leonora to Wyoming, where the deed could be stolen or claimed through forced marriage. It was a plan months in the making, requiring forged correspondence, bribed postal officials, and careful coordination with his criminal associates. While Pike tended his patient Hayamovi, waited on the clinic porch, his presence serving as both guard and statement. His Cheyenne band maintained a seasonal camp along Ash River, trading hides and timber with local merchants under the complex web of treaties governing tribal relations. The arrangement was precarious, constantly threatened by army patrols monitoring native movements with suspicious intensity. The Indian Wars of 1876 to 1877 had left deep scars, physical wounds that ached in cold weather, and deeper injuries of trust that might never heal. Hayamovi bore visible reminders: the stiff shoulder from a cavalry bullet, burn marks on his forearms, countless smaller scars that told stories of survival. but the deepest wounds remained invisible, carved into his heart by losses beyond description. His daughter, Singing Bird, had been 28 when she died, a young woman of exceptional beauty and intelligence, who'd served as a bridge between traditional ways and the changing world. Her husband, Swift Current, had shared her vision of peaceful coexistence. Together, they'd worked to establish good relations with nearby homesteaders. The raid that killed them had come without warning on a cold October night in 1877, striking their winter camp when most warriors were away hunting. The attackers had used military tactics and equipment, but wore no uniforms. They'd burned lodges with Greek fire military incendiary that couldn't be extinguished with water, while cutting down anyone who tried to flee. 17 people died that night, including 3 children and 2 elders. The Army's investigation concluded that renegade cavalry soldiers were responsible deserters who'd turned to random violence. But Hayamovi had never believed that explanation, sensing something more deliberate in the attack's precise timing and execution. Beatrice Howe appeared at the clinic door as afternoon shadows lengthened her arrival, perfectly timed to offer help without intruding. At 35, she ran the town's school and boarding house with efficient competence that frontier communities demanded. Her plain brown dress and severe hairstyle conformed to expectations for unmarried women, but they concealed sharp intelligence and iron determination. Dr. Pike said you needed lodging, she told Leonora. I have a room, and more importantly, I keep a loaded rifle. Out here, women watch out for each other. Heavy footsteps announced new arrivals. Armand Voss entered with Sheriff Dietrich Hale, their presence filling the small space with barely controlled menace. Voss was a large man with pale blue eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. His expensive clothing and cultured speech marked him as educated and refined. But something reptilian lurked behind his civilized facade, the calculating patience of a predator waiting to strike. Sheriff Hale cut a less impressive figure at 45, worn down by gambling debts and moral compromise. His badge carried theoretical weight, but everyone understood his true loyalty belonged to whoever paid his bills. Miss Zimmerman. Voss began with exaggerated courtesy, his voice carrying just enough threat to clarify his intentions. I believe there's been unfortunate confusion. You were promised to my foreman Heinrich Muller, not some fictional shopkeeper. I have proper documentation. He produced papers that appeared impressively official, complete with forged signatures and territorial seals. Leonora stared at them in confusion, her fever-weakened mind struggling to process this new deception. Those papers aren't worth spit, Beatrice declared. Few knew she'd once worked as a law clerk in Denver, helping attorneys research territorial statutes. This woman came here freely under false pretenses. She'll stay where she chooses. Voss's mask slipped momentarily, revealing cold fury. Sheriff Hale, perhaps you should search her belongings for stolen property. Before Hale could respond, Walter Briggs entered carrying his old squirrel rifle. At 42, he worked a small homestead that barely fed his family watching, while men like Voss controlled the territory's resources through force and corruption. Mighty crowded for a medical visit. Walter observed his weapon held casually, but ready. Maybe some folks should conduct business elsewhere. The tension stretched taut as Hayamovi stepped through the doorway, adding another element to the volatile mix. Dr. Pike reached for his shotgun, while Beatrice moved protectively near Leonora. In the charged silence, Walter's elbow knocked over an oil lamp. Glass shattered, plunging the room into darkness. In the confusion, Hayamovi guided Leonora out the back entrance, while Beatrice followed with the young woman's trunk. By the time Voss struck a match, his quarry had vanished. At Beatrice's boarding house, they barricaded doors and settled Leonora upstairs. Through the window, they could see lights moving restlessly through town. Voss's men searching for their missing prize. Why do they want me so desperately? Leonora asked weakly. Because you represent something they need. Beatrice replied carefully. And because men like Voss take what they want, regardless of law or decency. The night wind rattled windows with increasing intensity. Somewhere in that darkness, Armand Voss was planning his next move in a game whose stakes none of them yet understood. The attack erupted at midnight with sudden, overwhelming violence. Rifle bullets exploded through boarding house windows in a shower of glass, while a young student screamed as fragments rained on her bed. Beatrice grabbed her Winchester, shouting for everyone to take cover behind overturned furniture. Hayamovi had been dozing on the porch with warrior alertness. At the first muzzle flash, he rolled behind the water trough and returned fire. His bullet struck an attacking rider's stirrup, sending man and horse tumbling with curses that carried through the night. Walter arrived running from his homestead, his rifle answering the attacker's challenge. Between his steady fire and Hayamovi's expert marksmanship, the assault lost momentum. But the message was clear: surrender the girl or face escalating violence. In the chaos, Leonora's trunk tumbled downstairs, bursting open and scattering her possessions. Among her few dresses and faded photographs lay a wrapped packet she'd almost forgotten the land deed Klaus had pressed into her dying hands. As lamplight revealed the damage, Beatrice knelt beside the scattered papers. Her law clerk's eye immediately recognized the formal language and official seals of what Leonora had dismissed as a family memento. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "Leonora, do you understand what this is?" The young woman shook her head, still dazed from fever and fear. An original homestead deed properly filed and witnessed. 80 acres, including... Beatrice's voice caught. "Including Willow Springs and all associated water rights." Walter leaned over her shoulder, his farmer's understanding making him whistle low. No wonder Voss wants her. His cattle need that water to survive dry seasons. His mine needs it for washing ore. Without legal access, his empire collapses. Beatrice finished. This deed makes Leonora the most powerful person in the territory if she lives long enough to file it. Dr. Pike arrived with medical bag and shotgun, having heard the gunfire. As they explained their discovery, his weathered face grew grim. "Voss has tried buying or stealing water rights for years. That spring is everything cattle mining, farming the town itself. Your uncle's deed predates every claim Voss has made. But I don't understand American law," Leonora protested. "How can I fight someone with money and guns?" "By getting this deed to Judge Morrison in Sable Junction," Beatrice replied. "He's got a reputation for fairness and isn't in Voss's pocket. 50 miles through country Voss controls," Walter pointed out. "Won't be easy." Hayamovi spoke from the doorway. "Hard country makes strong people. We leave at dawn." The decision crystallized with simple authority. They would escort Leonora to Sable Junction, present the deed to Judge Morrison, and trust territorial law to settle matters fairly. As they prepared through the remaining hours of darkness, none noticed the small figure at an upstairs window, one of Voss's informants calculating how much this information might be worth. Before sunrise, every detail would reach Armand Voss's ears. Beatrice gathered legal documents while Walter cleaned his rifle. Pike prepared medical supplies, knowing violence would follow. Leonora sat beside her uncle's deed, trying to comprehend how paper could transform her from frightened immigrant to the center of a territorial power struggle. "Why didn't Uncle Klaus tell me the true value?" she asked. "Maybe he didn't fully understand," Beatrice replied thoughtfully. "Or maybe he knew exactly what desperate men would do to get it. Perhaps he thought you'd be safer not knowing until you were strong enough for the consequences." Through broken windows, gray dawn light began showing across Wyoming's landscape. Somewhere in that growing illumination, Armand Voss would be marshaling forces for pursuit. The race for Sable Junction was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than any of them dared imagine. Dawn broke cold across the unforgiving landscape as their unlikely alliance prepared for what they all understood would be dangerous, possibly fatal journey. Pike's assessment had been honest. Leonora could travel but slowly and with frequent rest to prevent her infection's return. Walter brought his lightest wagon and gentlest mare Sally, who'd carried his family through countless difficulties. Beatrice packed supplies with military efficiency, while Hayamovi appeared leading a fast pony, his rifle cleaned and ready. The plan seemed simple. Follow the main road south toward Sable Junction, avoiding mountain passes where ambush would be too easy. They'd travel during daylight when visibility favored defense camping nights, in locations offering natural protection and escape routes. But their strategy began unraveling within 5 miles. Dust clouds appeared behind them, growing larger. As mounted riders closed distance, the wagon was forced to travel at walking pace for Leonora's sake. There, Walter pointed to cottonwoods marking Prairie Creek's path. We can ford and use trees for cover. But another dust cloud materialized from the east. Sheriff Hale and deputies had circled ahead, establishing a roadblock at the only practical ford for miles. The trap was closing with military precision. What now? Beatrice demanded, knuckles white on her rifle. Hayamovi studied the tactical situation with trained eyes, weighing terrain against enemy positions. The creek ran low from autumn drought, but its banks were steep and treacherous. The ford represented the only safe wagon crossing, but Hale's position commanded it completely. I draw them off, he decided with calm finality. When they follow you, cross fast. Before anyone could protest, the warrior had transferred to his pony and was riding hard toward downstream trees. His war cry echoed across prairie with savage intensity, speaking of ancient battles and uncompromising courage. The psychological effect was immediate. Voss's riders couldn't resist pursuing a lone Indian warrior, splitting their force as 4 men thundered after Hayamovi, while only 2 continued toward the wagon. Walter whipped Sally into dangerous gallop toward the creek, the wagon bouncing violently, while Leonora gripped wooden sides to avoid being thrown out. Behind them, rifle fire cracked as Hayamovi engaged pursuers among the undergrowth. At the crossing, Hale stepped into the open with rifle raised. Stop there, you're under arrest for theft and conspiracy. Beatrice's Winchester answered from the wagon bed, her shot shattering Hale's rifle stock and sending splinters into his face. While he staggered backward, cursing, Walter drove into Prairie Creek at full speed, spray flying as wheels struck rocky bottom. One deputy fired his bullet, splintering the wagon's rail inches from Leonora's head. Another grazed Walter's ear, drawing blood but not stopping their headlong flight. They reached the far bank as afternoon shadows lengthened, but Hayamovi didn't return until sunset. When he finally appeared, his pony was lathered, and he bore fresh wounds, a bullet graze along his left arm and torn buckskin where another shot had passed through without touching flesh. 2 won't be riding soon, he reported matter-of-factly. Others learned to keep distance. Pike examined the wound, while Leonora tore petticoat strips for bandages, her hands steady despite everything. As she worked, she asked practical questions about pressure points and infection prevention. Where'd you learn field medicine? Pike asked. Uncle Klaus during the German wars, she replied simply. He said women needed such knowledge when men went to fight. That evening, they camped in scrub oak, building no fire that might reveal position. Sharing cold food and water, the reality settled over them like gathering darkness. Voss's influence extended far beyond Willow Springs, commanding resources that made their small band seem pathetically outmatched. But they'd survived the first test. Walter's courage, Beatrice's marksmanship, and Hayamovi's tactical skill had bought time and distance. Most importantly, Leonora's determination was hardening like steel in a forge. Miles behind around Copper Gulch, Mine's campfire, Voss studied maps with cold calculation. The direct approach had failed, but he commanded other resources, money, political connections, and an informant network extending throughout the territory, like a spider's web. Storm clouds were building in western mountains, promising to make travel even more treacherous. But they were committed now to their dangerous course. Turning back meant certain defeat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and they could only hope their fragile alliance would hold under increasing pressure. The second day brought complications, testing every member of their band. Rather than risk the main road where Voss's riders might wait in ambush, they followed back trails through rougher country, offering concealment at the cost of speed and comfort. Their detour led to abandoned Sweetwater School, a one-room log building, empty since its teacher died of consumption. The structure offered shelter from threatening weather, while providing defensible position where they could rest their horse and allow Leonora recovery time. "I can teach while we're here," Beatrice announced, dusting off the neglected blackboard. Men avoid schoolhouses like churches, consider them women's territory beneath their attention. Her strategy proved effective. Within an hour, curious children from nearby homesteads gathered, drawn by education's rare novelty. Among them was Talon, a shy 10-year-old Arapaho boy, whose family maintained peaceful relations with settlers. Leonora found unexpected comfort helping children with lessons, particularly young Talon, practicing writing his name in careful English letters. Teaching seemed to restore something the violence had threatened to destroy, purpose transcending immediate survival. But their sanctuary shattered when a rock crashed through the window, wrapped in paper bearing a crude message. "Water belongs to power, not foreign bitches." Children scattered while adults prepared for attack that never came, leaving them wondering whether this was psychological warfare or simple warning. "He's playing with us," Walter growled, scanning for hidden watchers. "Voss could hit hard if he wanted. This is about breaking our will." Hayamovi examined the rock with careful attention. "Fear is weapon like any other. He wants surrender without risking his men." But Leonora surprised them by standing straighter, her voice carrying new steel. "Then he misunderstands what it means to travel 3,000 miles for a new life. I won't be frightened into giving up." Their route took them through territory where other small farmers struggled against unforgiving soil, fighting constant battles with drought disease and economic exploitation. Word of their mission spread along informal networks, connecting isolated homesteads, gaining unexpected allies with their own reasons to oppose Voss's monopoly. Václav Novak, a 38-year-old Czech immigrant, offered supplies and ammunition, along with intelligence about Voss's movements. His weather-beaten face showed permanent marks of outdoor labor, while accented English carried determination of a man who'd crossed an ocean to build something better. "That bastard's been squeezing us for years," he explained bluntly. "Water fees, grazing fees, transport fees, always another way, taking money from honest farmers. If you break his spring control, maybe we can finally prosper." Harriet Pruitt proved even more valuable, the 40-year-old widow managing her late husband's homestead while raising 2 children alone. She provided supplies and intelligence gathered through careful observation and strategic friendships with Voss's disgruntled employees. "My husband worked at Copper Gulch briefly before he died," she explained, spreading a hand-drawn map. "Never trusted Voss, always said something was wrong about that operation. This shows the facility layout, including passages not on official surveys." These settlers understood the water rights battle affected their survival directly. Willow Creek fed irrigation ditches and livestock ponds, providing margin between subsistence and starvation during frequent droughts. If Voss gained complete control, he could fence it off, charge whatever fees he chose, or deny access to anyone opposing his interests. "We're with you to Sable Junction," Václav declared with frontier commitment. "This is about more than your deed. It's whether ordinary families survive when rich men want our land." The support bolstered spirits, but revealed their enemy's true scope. Voss didn't simply want Leonora's deed. He needed to eliminate any challenge to territorial dominance before it inspired widespread resistance. Their most dangerous test came when their route passed within 2 miles of Copper Gulch mine itself. The direct road skirted the mining operations perimeter. An attempting wide detour would add days, while exposing them to greater risks in unfamiliar territory. Pike's medical judgment was uncompromising. Leonora needed proper care soon, or her infection might return fatally. There's a path through mine workings, cutting 15 miles off our route. Harriet had told them, producing her husband's detailed map. Dangerous after dark if you don't know the layout, but it's your best chance reaching Sable Junction before Voss organizes another major ambush. The map revealed complex maze of ore cart tracks, abandoned shafts, processing buildings, and equipment yards, comprising one of the territory's largest mining operations. The proposed route required abandoning their wagon and traveling afoot through industrial terrain Voss knew intimately. They approached the complex at midnight, when most workers would sleep and security would be lightest. Hayamovi scouted ahead, while others followed single file through the maze of structures, footsteps echoing strangely among derricks and processing equipment. Attack erupted without warning as they passed between massive ore carts, muzzle flashes from 3 directions, while bullets sparked off metal rails and splintered wooden timbers. Voss's men had waited in prepared positions, turning the mine into deadly trap. Hayamovi reacted with warrior instincts, using a broken shovel handle as weapon and lever to tip an empty ore cart across narrow tracks, creating improvised cover. Walter grabbed a railroad timber, wielding it like a club to catch one attacker across shoulders and send him sprawling. Beatrice took careful aim, despite chaos, putting a bullet through another man's thigh and dropping him behind crushed rock, where he continued firing with reduced accuracy. But Leonora provided the evening's greatest surprise. Despite recent illness and sheltered upbringing, she grabbed Walter's fallen rifle and began reloading with steady hands, passing ammunition to Beatrice, while staying low behind their barricade. "Where'd you learn firearms?" Beatrice gasped between shots. "Uncle Klaus during German wars," Leonora replied with composure. "He said women needed such knowledge when the world turned violent." The firefight was brutal, and close quarters decided more by determination than marksmanship. When Greasy Pete tried flanking their position, Hayamovi caught him with knife thrust, opening a long gash along his forearm. The freighter's scream echoed among equipment as he stumbled away, clutching his wound. They escaped through drainage tunnel, emerging near the main road, but the cost was significant. Hayamovi's earlier wound had reopened, bleeding through makeshift bandages. Walter bore fresh bruises from a glancing blow. Most seriously, their position was completely compromised. Voss knew exactly where they were heading. As dawn broke gray and threatening, they found shelter in an abandoned line shack and inventoried their desperate situation. Still 20 miles from Sable Junction, with limited ammunition, a wounded warrior, and mounting evidence their enemy commanded resources far beyond imagination. "It can't keep running like this," Pike observed bluntly. "Leonora needs proper rest, and we need better strategy than hoping to outrun mounted men." Then fate intervened. Through morning mist came a lone rider approaching slowly with hands visible and empty. As the figure drew closer, they could see it was a woman, well-dressed, despite harsh conditions. Nervous, but determined to make contact, despite obvious risks. "My name is Nora Beck," she called when 50 yards away. "I work for Armand Voss, but I have information that will change everything. I need to talk before it's too late." The abandoned line shack offered meager comfort against morning chill, but provided concealment as storm clouds built in western mountains. Nora Beck sat across from them, her expensive dress incongruous in primitive surroundings, hands trembling, as she opened a leather portfolio that would transform their understanding of Armand Voss and his empire. At 32, Nora had served as Voss's bookkeeper for 3 years, maintaining meticulous records with attention to detail that made her invaluable. What others didn't know, what she was about to reveal, was that she was also his cousin, bound by family ties that had gradually become a prison of complicity and terror. "I've kept records of every transaction, every payment, every deal since I started working for him." She began, voice steady despite obvious fear. "Armand trusted me because we're family. Assumed blood loyalty meant I'd never question his methods. But I've seen too much. I can't stay silent." The ledger she spread contained 3 years of evidence, painting Voss not simply as ruthless businessman, but as criminal, whose empire was built on systematic violence, murder, and corruption, reaching every level of territorial government. Entries were written in Nora's careful hand, but documented crimes that made Walter whistle, while Beatrice covered her mouth in horror. Here, Nora pointed to 18-month-old entries. Postal bribes to intercept Hamburg mail, bank drafts financing the Heinrich Miller deception, payments to forgers for false documents. He's planned stealing your uncle's deed over a year since learning about the land grant from surveying contracts. But systematic deception was only the beginning. As she turned deeper into the ledger, the true scope emerged. Payments to freelance security for clearing obstacles from mining routes. Bribes to army officers for advance intelligence on hostile movements. Most damning, a series of payments corresponding exactly with dates Pike recognized from his medical records. Cedar Creek. The physician whispered face-draining color as terrible memories flooded back. The massacre at Cedar Creek Village, October 1877. I treated survivors, burn victims. Army claimed it was random attack by renegade cavalry. Wasn't random, Nora said quietly. Our mom paid for that raid. The village blocked his ore wagon route to railroad. He needed them eliminated for uninterrupted silver shipments to Denver. Hayamovi had listened silently, but now leaned forward with deadly intensity, scarred hands, tracing ledger entries with growing recognition and barely controlled rage. My daughter, he said, voice barely controlled despite years of practice concealing emotion. Singing Bird and her husband Swift Current died in that raid. Burned alive in their lodge when attackers used Greek fire military incendiary that burns so hot water can't extinguish it. She was 28, carrying her first child. The connection struck everyone like physical blow, revealing the personal dimension of Voss's crimes beyond mere business corruption. This wasn't simply about water rights. This was about a man who'd orchestrated innocent families' murder to advance commercial schemes. I have proof. Nora continued, voice stronger now that worst revelations were shared. Payments were made through intermediaries, but there's complete paper trail linking every transaction to specific dates and activities. From her portfolio, she produced several crucial items. First was a distinctive wolf-head wax seal Voss used on payment authorizations, its unique design making forgery virtually impossible. Second was a silver concho traditional native ornament, looted from the destroyed village and later pawned for drinking money. One of the raiders sold this at town pawn shop 3 weeks after the massacre. She explained, placing the ornament carefully on the table. I recognized it from jewelry descriptions in Army investigation reports and bought it back as evidence. The shopkeeper recorded the transaction. It provides direct link between the raid and Voss's hired killers. Hayamovi took the concho with reverent care, weathered fingers, tracing intricate patterns, speaking of traditional craftsmanship. His dark eyes filled with moisture. He didn't attempt hiding as he examined the piece connecting him to his murdered daughter across death's divide. I made this for Singing Bird's 16th birthday, he said softly, voice thick with emotion. Taught her traditional designs our mothers used for generations, patterns, telling stories of our people's history. See this small flaw in silverwork, my mistake as young craftsman, but she said it made the piece uniquely hers. The emotional impact was overwhelming, but Beatrice's legal training helped process practical implications. Combined with Pike's medical records and financial documentation, this could hang Voss for murder and conspiracy. We're not just fighting for water rights, we're carrying evidence of capital crimes that could bring down his entire organization. Walter understood military significance. If army officers accepted bribes providing intelligence for civilian attacks, this corruption reaches territorial command. Half the Indian troubles in this region might trace to Voss's interference. But their moment of revelation was brutally interrupted by approaching horses' hoofbeats, clearly audible, despite morning mist that should have muffled sound. Through rain-streaked windows, they could see riders surrounding the shack, Voss himself leading 6 heavily armed men. He followed me. Nora gasped, face paling with mistake realization. I tried being careful covering tracks, but he must have suspected when I left the mine this morning. The door burst open before they could mount defense, revealing Voss framed in the entrance like an avenging angel of corruption. His pale blue eyes swept the interior, taking in the scene with cold calculation that had enabled his rise to power. Behind him, Greasy Pete cradled his bandaged arm, while maintaining rifle-grip face twisted with anticipated revenge. Sheriff Hale kept his weapon trained, despite splinters still embedded in his cheeks from Beatrice's earlier shot. "My dear cousin," Voss said with mock courtesy, not disguising lethal threat. "I hope you've enjoyed your brief rebellion against family loyalty. Unfortunately, blood obligations demand I now correct your serious error in judgment." Confrontation erupted into violence without warning. Voss lunged for the ledger, while Hale shouted orders, their coordinated assault designed to capture evidence while eliminating witnesses. In chaos that followed, Walter overturned the wooden table, providing desperate cover, while Beatrice shoved crucial evidence pages into a metal biscuit tin that might survive coming destruction. Hayamovi moved to shield Leonora, his rifle, appearing despite close quarters and overwhelming odds. Gunshots thundered in confined space as both sides fought desperately for control of evidence, determining the territory's entire future. In confusion and gunsmoke, Nora made desperate break for the door, clutching ledger portion that could still condemn her cousin. She almost reached safety, hand actually touching wooden frame representing escape and redemption. But Snakebite Sue's knife found its mark between her ribs with precision of long practice opening wound that sent bright blood cascading down expensive dress. She fell to knees in muddy ground outside rainwater, mixing with life's blood, as she pressed something small and metallic into Leonora's desperate grasp. "Not the wolf seal," she gasped with dying breath voice, barely audible above continuing violent sounds. "Keep it safe. Make them pay for what they've done." The line shack caught fire, whether from overturned lamps or deliberate arson, forcing both sides to retreat into the storm that had finally arrived with full fury. In smoke and confusion, Hayamovi guided survivors through rear window, while Walter provided covering fire, allowing escape into driving rain. But they left behind more than temporary shelter. They left behind comfortable illusion. They were involved in simple property dispute. Now they knew horrifying truth about Armand Voss and methods he used maintaining his empire. The cattle baron wasn't just greedy businessman, but murderer who'd orchestrated innocent families' deaths, advancing commercial schemes. The water rights battle had become quest for justice, determining whether evil could triumph through money and political connections, or whether ordinary people could stand against tyranny when they finally understood true stakes. As they fled through October's storm, carrying evidence that could bring down a killer, none yet realized their most dangerous trials still lay ahead in treacherous country between them and Sable Junction's safety. The line shack blazed behind them like funeral pyre as they fled into the storm flames, licking through broken windows while casting hellish shadows across rain-soaked prairie. The fire had been deliberately set, Voss's method ensuring any evidence left behind would be reduced to ash, eliminating potential witnesses along with incriminating documents. But the most crucial proof traveled with them in Beatrice's metal tin, protected from both flames and driving rain, now making every step treacherous. The storm, providing cover for escape, was rapidly becoming their greatest enemy, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud and reducing visibility to mere yards. Pike's horse stumbled badly in a hidden gully, throwing the physician hard against a jutting boulder. When they reached him through driving rain, his left leg was twisted, unnaturally clearly broken, below the knee and compound fracture that would make him dangerous liability in desperate flight. "Splint it and leave me." Pike gasped through gritted teeth, medical training making him brutally realistic. Send help from Sable Junction if you make it alive. Not happening. Walter replied firmly, already cutting branches to fashion crude stretcher. Started this fight together, we'll finish it the same way. But problems multiplied as they struggled providing medical attention. A rifle shot cracked through Storm with deadly authority, the bullet taking Walter high in the back and spinning him around before dropping him face first into churning mud. When they rolled him over with desperate hands, bright blood was seeping through his shirt. Breathing coming in, short, painful gasps, speaking of serious internal damage. Lung shot, Pike diagnosed with professional detachment despite his own agony. Nothing I can do under these conditions. He needs real surgeon and proper operating room soon. Greasy Pete emerged from rocks above like avenging demon rifle smoking, and scarred face twisted with savage satisfaction. That's for my arm, you interfering bastards. Boss says bring the German bitch alive, but rest of you can die slow and hard as I can manage. Hayamovi's return shot sent Pete diving for cover, but damage was done. Walter could still walk short distances with support, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly as blood filled his punctured lung. The direct route to Sable Junction had become impossible with 2 seriously wounded men slowing progress to crawl. There's another way through Ash River Gorge, Beatrice said desperately, studying Nora's crude map. Dangerous as hell in this weather, but only 15 miles to railroad camp at Timberline instead of 30 to Sable Junction. The gorge was notorious narrow canyon, where spring floods had carved treacherous paths through solid rock over countless centuries. Mule trails descending into its depths were barely wide enough for single horse, and one misstep meant fatal plunge to jagged rocks 200 feet below. But Timberline's railroad camp had telegraph station where they could summon federal assistance if they reached it alive. As they prepared for perilous descent, Walter pulled Beatrice aside with obvious effort, weathered face gray with pain, but eyes still clear despite mortal wound. Won't make it through that gorge, he admitted quietly, blood-flecking lips. Lungs filling fast, can feel myself getting weaker with every breath. But I can still shoot straight a little longer. Might be enough buying you time needed. Don't talk like that, she protested desperately. We'll find a way getting you through this. Walter shook his head with sad certainty of a man understanding exactly what was happening to his body. Look after my family if you can. Tell them. He paused, gathering strength. Tell them I fought for clean water, for honest law, for the right of ordinary folks making their own way without bowing to killers. The decision to enter Ash River Gorge was made by appearance of more riders on the horizon, at least a dozen men converging from multiple directions. Voss had called reinforcements from mining operations, and ranch hands marshaling small army that could overwhelm their defenses through sheer numbers. The narrow canyon might be treacherous beyond description, but it represented their only remaining escape route from rapidly becoming hopeless situation. As they began terrifying descent, the storm intensified with fury of nature, unleashed in all destructive power. Lightning split sky with supernatural brilliance, while thunder echoed between stone walls like artillery from cosmic war. The trail was slick with rainfall and loose gravel, forcing them to lead horses carefully down serpentine path, seeming to descend into Earth's very bowels. Behind them, Walter took position behind fallen log, with rifle loaded and ready face set, in grim determination, despite blood continuing to stain his shirt. Through driving rain, they could see Voss's riders approaching canyon rim horses, dancing nervously as they debated following quarry into dangerous passage. Walter's first shot answered their hesitation, dropping one man from saddle and sending others scrambling for whatever cover they could find. His rifle continued speaking defiance as companions descended beyond sight, each carefully aimed bullet, buying precious seconds and yards of safety. The last they saw of Walter Briggs, he was reloading methodically despite growing weakness, farm-toughened shoulders squared against storm, as he prepared selling his life as dearly as possible. His shots echoed down into canyon long after they passed beyond visual contact drumbeat of courage, reminding them some principles were worth dying for. At Ash River Gorge's bottom, the normally placid stream had transformed into raging torrent, carrying tree branches, boulders, and debris in brown flood, threatening to sweep away anything foolish enough to challenge its power. The mule trail continued along water's edge, but spring flooding had washed out several crucial sections. "You'll have to cross somehow," Hayamovi decided after studying angry water with eyes of someone who'd spent his life reading natural hazards. "There's fallen cottonwood about 200 yards downstream that might support our weight if we're careful and lucky." The makeshift bridge was massive tree undermined by earlier floods, now lying at precarious angle across torrent trunk, slick with moss and spray, while rushing water below waited hungrily to claim anyone losing footing or nerve. Pike, despite broken leg and obvious agony, insisted on crossing first with characteristic courage. "If I fall, you're not losing anything essential to mission success. If one of you falls whole, effort fails, and Walter's sacrifice becomes meaningless." His bravery shamed them all. But it was Hayamovi who took actual lead, tying safety ropes around each person's waist and securing them to solid anchors on both sides. The passage became exercise in pure terror, inching across treacherous log while water roared beneath and lightning turned gorge into hellscape of reflected fire. Leonora surprised everyone by moving steadily despite recent illness and complete lack of experience with such hazards, fear overcome by desperate determination and knowledge that retreat was no longer possible. Beatrice followed with evidence tin clutched against her chest like sacred relic composure, finally cracking under accumulated stress. When she slipped halfway across feet, losing purchase on slick surface, only Hayamovi's quick reflexes and safety rope prevented her being swept away by flood to certain death among downstream rocks. They made it to far side as full darkness fell. But ordeal was far from over. The trail up opposite wall was even more treacherous than descent, and somewhere behind them in storm, Voss's men were still pursuing, despite natural obstacles, and Walter's heroic rearguard action. The gunfire sound had finally ceased, suggesting their friend's brave stand had reached inevitable conclusion. But his sacrifice had bought them time and distance needed for attempting the final phase of their desperate journey to safety and justice. As they climbed through storm toward distant lights of Timberline Railroad Camp, each step forward represented small victory against overwhelming odds and natural forces seeming determined to claim their lives before they could complete their mission. But the most dangerous challenges still awaited them at Canyon's rim, where nature's forces and human evil would combine in final test of their courage, determination, and will to survive. The storm reached terrifying climax as they emerged from Ash River Gorge onto High Plateau, where Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had carved its route through mountains with dynamite and human determination. Lightning split black sky with supernatural fury, while wind-driven rain transformed the world into maze of shifting shadows and deafening sound, seeming to herald all things end. Through chaos and driving precipitation, they could see Timberline Camp's scattered lights, like hope beacons in darkness salvation, tantalizingly close at just 1 mile across open ground. But salvation would demand price in blood, and courage none had imagined when their journey began. Armand Voss waited at Wooden Trestle Bridge, carrying railroad over Deadman's Gulch, his remaining men positioned with military precision to control the only safe passage to Telegraph Station and federal help. The cattle baron had anticipated their route with strategic thinking that built his empire, turning bridge into killing ground, where superior numbers and firepower could decide battle on his terms. "You're nowhere left to run, Miss Zimmerman," Voss shouted across howling wind voice, carrying clearly despite storm's fury. "Sign that deed over right now, and I'll allow your friends to see another sunrise. Refuse, and I'll feed you all to ravens." From their position among railroad maintenance equipment, they could count at least 8 men with Voss Greasy Pete with bandaged arm, but undiminished hatred. Sheriff Hale limping from earlier wound, but still armed and dangerous, plus 6 hardened gunfighters recruited from mining camps where violence was just another business tool. The odds were impossible by reasonable calculation. But retreat would mean Walter's heroic sacrifice accomplished nothing beyond delaying inevitable. They'd come too far and endured too much to surrender when justice and law's rule hung in balance. Hayamovi studied tactical situation with warriors' trained eye, noting defensive positions, fire angles, and potential advantages that might offset enemies' overwhelming numerical superiority. The trestle stretched 50 yards across chasm where Deadman's Creek roared through rapids 200 feet below, while railroad equipment provided some cover on their side. "The black powder," he said quietly, pointing to barrels marked with warning symbols near tool shed. Railroad crews use explosives, clearing rock slides and blasting new routes. If we could reach those charges. Pike nodded, despite Payne understanding tactical implications immediately. "I've seen demolition work during the war. There's enough explosive material to bring down half that trestle if properly placed and detonated." But reaching powder storage meant crossing open ground under direct fire from Voss's positioned rifleman's suicide mission, requiring perfect timing, considerable luck, and desperate courage, distinguishing heroes from ordinary men. Battle erupted when Snakebite Sue fired first shot, her bullet striking sparks from steel rail near Leonora's position, announcing negotiation time had passed forever. Immediately, night exploded in muzzle flashes, and competing weapons thunder, each side fighting for position and advantage in hellish illumination provided by lightning and gunfire. Hayamovi moved first, using overturned ore car for cover, as he began dangerous advance toward explosive storage. His progress was measured in yards, gained at terrible risk, each movement drawing concentrated fire from enemies, understanding his objective's deadly implications. Beatrice proved her marksmanship by putting bullet through Hale's other thigh, sending corrupt lawman tumbling behind railroad ties, where he continued firing with dramatically reduced accuracy and mobility. Her second shot shattered the lantern Pete was using for illumination, plunging battlefield portions into darkness, favoring defenders. But Leonora shocked everyone by grabbing Walter's abandoned rifle and joining fight with deadly seriousness, her first shot going wide, but second catching one of Voss's hired gunmen in shoulder and spinning him around before his weapon went clattering into gorge below. "Where in God's name did you learn shooting like that?" Beatrice demanded between frantic reloads. "Hamburg during the Revolution," Leonora replied with remarkable composure. "Uncle Klaus said women needed protecting themselves when civilized society collapsed." Battle raged across rain-soaked plateau as both sides maneuvered for advantage through superior position and tactical movement. Lightning struck towering pine with devastating force, splitting it down middle, and starting fire spreading rapidly, despite driving rain, adding another danger element to already desperate situation. The flames provided hellish illumination for continuing gunfight, while creating additional hazards both sides had to navigate carefully. Hayamovi reached powder storage and began fashioning crude charges from available materials. But Voss's men were closing from multiple directions with methodical determination. In chaos, midst Voss himself advanced across Trestle Bridge using wooden beams and iron supports for cover while shouting orders to scattered forces. His pale eyes gleamed with murderous rage as he focused on Leonora, the woman whose simple existence threatened destroying everything he'd built through decades of violence and systematic corruption. "You could have lived comfortably as my foreman's wife," he screamed over Storm voice, cracking with fury and desperation. "Instead, you chose aligning yourself with savages and criminals. Now you'll die for monumental stupidity." His rifle spoke twice rapidly, both bullets passing close enough that Leonora felt their wind and heard deadly whisper. Only Hayamovi's quick action pulling her behind Orkar prevented her death in that terrifying moment of maximum danger. The turning point came when Beatrice noticed something others missed in chaos. One of Hayamovi's improvised powder charges had created thin trail of spilled black powder leading from storage barrels toward Trestle Bridge base. If that trail could be ignited, resulting explosion would not only destroy Voss's position, but potentially bring down entire structure in catastrophic collapse. "The powder trail," she shouted to Hayamovi over thunder and gunfire. "Can you light it?" The warrior understood immediately. Tactical mind-grasping possibilities and risks in split-second calculation. Using burning brand from lightning-struck pine, he began crawling toward fateful trail of explosive powder, while companions provided covering fire, keeping Voss's men from advancing to better positions. Bullets struck all around him as he inched forward through storm and chaos, one grazing ribs another, shattering left wrist, but still he pressed on toward moment determining their fate. Behind him, Leonora and Beatrice maintained steady fire, preventing enemy from concentrating assault on his vulnerable position. Pike, despite broken leg and precarious situation, managed wounding another hired gunfighter with his pistol, slightly reducing odds against their small band of desperate survivors. But time was running out as ammunition dwindled and Voss methodically closed range for final, overwhelming assault. Hayamovi reached Powder Trail just as Pete appeared around Orcar rifle aimed directly at Warrior's head. For heartbeats seeming to last forever, two men stared at each other across a death's barrel, while rain and fire created scene from hell's very depths itself. The shot that broke deadlock came from unexpected direction. Leonora had circled through shadows and smoke movements, concealed by battle's chaos, now standing behind Pete, with Walter's rifle smoking in steady hands. The freighter collapsed without sound, his threat ended forever, by woman he'd tormented since her Wyoming arrival. With path finally clear, Hayamovi touched burning brand to Powder Trail, and watched flame race across wet ground, like living thing seeking barrels that would provide explosive force sufficient to shatter Voss's final stronghold and end his terror reign. The explosion was magnificent and terrible pillar of fire rising into storm-torn sky, while concussion waves shattered windows in Timberline Camp a mile away and sent shock waves rippling through Earth itself. When smoke finally cleared and ears stopped ringing, half the Trestle Bridge had collapsed into Dead Man's Gulch. But the true climax came in quieter moment of grim discovery. Through clearing smoke, they could see Voss himself trapped on the damaged bridge section, his left leg pinned under twisted metal, while blood streamed from multiple cuts. His pale eyes, which had terrorized the territory for years, now held something they'd never shown before, fear of the justice he'd spent so long avoiding. "Help me," he gasped as Leonora approached the edge of the intact bridge section, the wolf-head seal clutched in her hand, along with the silver concho that had belonged to Hayamovi's murdered daughter. "I can pay you more than you've ever dreamed. Water rights land grants gold claims, anything you want." Leonora studied his face for a long moment, this man who had orchestrated so much suffering in pursuit of power and wealth. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had found strength through trials that would have broken weaker spirits. "Justice isn't for sale, Mr. Voss. Some things can't be bought with blood money." She turned away as the damaged bridge section gave way, completely carrying Armand Voss into the depths of Deadman's Gulch, where his reign of terror ended with the sound of rushing water far below. With his death, the immediate threat to her claim was ended, along with the corrupt network that had terrorized the territory for years. But as she held the physical evidence of his crimes, the seal that had authorized murder, and the concho stolen from a grieving father, Leonora understood that true justice would require more than one man's death. It would need the careful rebuilding of law and community, from the foundations up. "It's finished," Hayamovi said simply, his weathered hands trembling with exhaustion, and the overwhelming relief of finally seeing his daughter's death answered through legal evidence rather than mere revenge. "No," Leonora replied, her voice strong despite everything they'd endured together. "Now the real work begins." Dawn broke clear and cold over destruction at Dead Man's Gulch Storm having exhausted its fury during night and left behind crystalline morning promising better days ahead. The collapsed trestle lay twisted in canyon below, like broken bones of enormous beast, while smoke still rose from scattered fires among railroad equipment, where their desperate battle had been fought and won. In morning light, the full scope of their victory and its terrible cost became apparent to survivors. Pike had managed splinting his own broken leg using railroad materials and medical knowledge, though he'd need proper surgical attention soon to prevent permanent disability. Hayamovi's numerous wounds were painful, but not life-threatening, though his shattered left wrist would require careful setting to heal properly. Most importantly, Leonora showed no signs of her infection returning despite stress and physical demands of their ordeal. If anything, trials they'd endured seemed to have strengthened rather than weakened her constitution, transforming frightened immigrant girl into young woman of remarkable determination. Voss's surviving forces had scattered during night like leaves before autumn wind, and those who could still walk disappearing into wilderness rather than face questions about their employer's criminal activities and their own complicity in systematic violence. Sheriff Hale had bled to death from accumulated wounds, removing another corrupt official from territorial law enforcement. As they tended wounds and inventoried their situation, sound of approaching railroad handcar reached them from Timberline Camp direction. 3 men rode the small vehicle track supervisor, telegraph operator, and most surprisingly, tall man, wearing Federal Marshal's Silver Star. Marshal Oscar Tillman was 50 years old, weathered by decades of frontier law enforcement, possessed of quiet authority, marking men who'd survived by making sound decisions under extreme pressure. He'd received telegraph message during night and traveled immediately to investigate reports of armed conflict near railroad right-of-way. Quite spectacular mess you folks created. He observed mildly, surveying destruction with professional interest. Care to explain how property dispute escalated into what looks like small-scale war? Beatrice opened her precious biscuit tin with trembling hands and spread evidence across a makeshift table: Nora Beck's ledger pages, Pike's medical records, Wolfhead's seal, and silver concho, tying everything together in unbreakable chain of proof. As she explained connections between each piece, Tillman's weathered face grew increasingly grim, with realization of what they'd uncovered. "Cedar Creek," he said when she finished. "I investigated that massacre personally. Army claimed renegade cavalry responsibility, but evidence never quite supported that conclusion. Too organized, too precisely targeted for random violence." He examined Concho with careful attention. "You say this belonged to one of the victims?" Hayamovi took silver piece with reverent hands, voice steady but heavy with emotion as he explained its significance. "My daughter's singing bird. I crafted this for her 16th birthday, teaching her traditional patterns our mothers used for countless generations. See this small flaw in metalwork. My mistake as young silversmith, but she said it made the piece uniquely hers." The marshal's face softened with genuine sympathy. "Deeply sorry for what happened to your family. If this evidence proves genuine under proper legal examination, we're looking at conspiracy charges, multiple murders, and systematic corruption reaching territorial government." Pike provided crucial corroboration by producing original medical logs from Cedar Creek aftermath records maintained with meticulous care despite passing years. Dates and descriptions of burn wounds matched perfectly with payments recorded in Nora's ledger, creating unbreakable evidence chain linking Voss directly to massacre and its cover-up. There's also fundamental matter of water rights, Tillman noted, examining Leonora's deed with thoroughness of someone understanding territorial law. This appears completely legitimate homestead documentation, properly filed and witnessed according to federal statute. Under existing law, it takes clear precedence over any competing claims. Legal resolution proved surprisingly straightforward once corruption web was exposed and dismantled. Voss's various claims to Willow Springs' water source had been based entirely on forged documents, bribed officials, and systematic intimidation of legitimate claimants. With his death and criminal network exposure, those false claims collapsed completely. But human cost could never be calculated with such clinical precision. Walter Briggs had died defending principles he believed in, leaving behind wife and 2 children, who would struggle maintaining their homestead without his strength. Nora Beck had found courage to oppose her cousin's crimes, but too late to save her own life or prevent suffering her complicity had enabled. Cedar Creek massacre victims represented lives cut short by one man's insatiable greed for power, and resources their deaths crying out for justice across years that had passed since that terrible night. But at least now their killer had been held accountable, and their families could know they hadn't died in vain. As they prepared for a careful journey back to Willow Springs, Tillman made arrangements for federal oversight of ongoing territorial investigation. Army officers suspected of accepting bribes would face court-martial proceedings, while surviving members of Voss's criminal organization would be hunted down and prosecuted to full extent of territorial and federal law. Justice moves slowly in frontier country, he warned them with realism of long experience. But it does move when good people stand up for what's right. What you've accomplished will make real difference for years to come. The return journey took 3 days of careful travel, moving slowly to accommodate Pike's injury, while allowing proper rest stops for everyone to recover from their ordeal. Along the way, they encountered other homesteaders and ranchers who'd heard rumors of battle at Deadman's Gulch and Voss's death. News spread like prairie fire across territory, bringing hope to settlers who'd lived under Cattle Baron's shadow for years without seeing any possibility of escape or justice. At each stop, Leonora spoke quietly with local farmers and small ranchers, explaining that water rights would be administered fairly for all legitimate users' benefit, rather than being monopolized by whoever had most money and guns. Her quiet authority and obvious sincerity impressed men who'd expected another carpetbagger seeking to exploit their desperation for personal profit. "She's got backbone for this kind of work," one grizzled cattleman observed to his neighbor. "Shame about all the dying it took getting here, but maybe something good will finally come of the suffering." As they approached Willow Springs on 3rd day, they could see smoke rising from town. Not black smoke of destruction and violence, but white smoke of cooking fires, productive activity, and normal life resuming after a period of fear and uncertainty. Word of their success had preceded them through informal network connecting frontier communities, and Willow Springs people were preparing to welcome home survivors of ordeal that had fundamentally changed everything about their future prospects. 2 weeks after their return, first snow of winter dusted peaks surrounding Willow Springs, transforming harsh landscape into something approaching beauty and promising fresh start that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Territorial judge had arrived the previous day, accompanied by clerks and legal documents that would formalize dramatic changes wrought by recent events and their bloody resolution. Judge Morrison proved exactly what Beatrice had promised: fair-minded man of integrity, immune to corruption, and genuinely committed to upholding territorial law regardless of political pressure or financial inducement. His review of evidence against Voss's criminal organization was swift and thorough, resulting in formal declarations invalidating every fraudulent claim the cattle baron had made during his years of systematic theft and violence. Leonora stood before the judge in her carefully mended blue dress lace collar, now repaired with thread that didn't quite match original, but served its essential purpose. At 22, she'd aged years in space of weeks, but transformation had brought strength and wisdom rather than bitterness or despair. When asked how she wished crucial water rights to be administered, her answer surprised everyone present with its generosity and long-term thinking. As a public trust held for benefit of all legitimate users, she declared with clear conviction, "The spring belongs to this territory, and its people, settlers, ranchers, farmers, and Cheyenne families who've depended on this water since long before any of us arrived. I'll serve as trustee, ensuring fair access and proper maintenance. But no single person should ever again control what nature provides freely to all who need it. Judge Morrison nodded with obvious approval at her wisdom and maturity. An excellent decision, Miss Zimmerman. Territorial government will support this arrangement with appropriate legal protections and federal oversight, ensuring its permanence. Practical arrangements required several days of detailed meetings in expanded schoolhouse, with representatives from various communities working out specific terms of water access, maintenance responsibilities, and conflict resolution procedures. Settlers would pay modest fees covering costs of maintaining irrigation channels and protecting spring from contamination, while Cheyenne Band would have guaranteed access for seasonal camps and traditional uses. Local ranchers could water herds without fear of arbitrary exclusion or excessive fees, while small farmers would have irrigation water needed, making their homesteads profitable and sustainable. Most importantly, legal framework would prevent any individual or organization from ever again monopolizing this vital resource for private profit at community welfare's expense. Pike had his broken leg properly set by a colleague from Denver, though he'd walk with slight limp for remainder of his life, permanent reminder of night they'd fought for justice at Deadman's Gulch. The experience had convinced him to expand medical practice beyond basic frontier medicine, and he announced plans for proper clinic funded by contributions from water users throughout territory. Medical care shouldn't depend on person's ability to pay, he explained to anyone who listened. Out here, we're all in this struggle together, and disease doesn't care about your bank account size or skin color. Hayamovi's numerous wounds healed well under Pike's continued care, though his left hand remained partially stiff from shattered wrist bones disability that would affect traditional craft work, but not his ability contributing to community they were building together. His next project involved working with Beatrice, designing communal bathhouse, providing proper sanitation facilities for growing settlement. Infection comes from poor conditions and inadequate cleanliness, he observed with practical wisdom. Clean water for drinking, proper facilities for washing, adequate nutrition and rest. These things prevent sickness kind that caused you such suffering when you first arrived. Beatrice had emerged from their shared ordeal with renewed purpose and expanded influence within territorial community. Her school grew to serve both settler and Cheyenne children, teaching practical skills alongside traditional academic subjects in arrangement controversial among some families, but having territorial judges' strong support. Education breaks down barriers that fear and ignorance create, she explained to critics and supporters alike. These children will grow up together, work together as adults, and build something better than legacy of violence and mistrust we inherited from previous generations. The final surprise came on crystal-clear morning when Hayamovi approached Leonora at Spring, where their unlikely partnership had begun. In his scarred hands, he carried 2 items that federal investigators had released after completing comprehensive criminal investigation and prosecution of surviving conspirators. First was Wolfhead's seal that had served as Voss's signature on documents authorizing murder, bribery, and systematic corruption throughout territory. Marshal Tillman had retrieved it from crime scene and confirmed its crucial role in evidence chain that would convict surviving members of criminal organization. Second item was silver concho that had belonged to Hayamovi's daughter, ornament stolen during Cedar Creek massacre and later pawned for drinking money by one of raiders. Beatrice had located it in town pawn shop using information from Nora Beck's dying confession, and shop owner's meticulous records provided another crucial link in evidence chain that had finally brought justice for victims. Pawn shop ledger shows exact transaction date. Hayamovi explained, voice steady but deeply emotional. 3 weeks after raid man matching Pete's description sold this ornament for whiskey money. Clerk noted unique flaw in metalwork, same distinctive imperfection I remember making when Singing Bird was young and I was still learning traditional silversmithing techniques. He placed concho in Leonora's hands, its silver surface worn smooth by years of handling, but still beautiful in traditional craftsmanship and cultural significance. Pike's medical records show he treated my daughter's fatal burns on October 15, 1877. Nora's ledger documents that Voss made payments for route clearing operations on October 10th, same year. Your uncle's surveying notes show he mapped that transportation route for mining wagons in September, just weeks before attack. Every piece of evidence connects to every other piece in pattern no honest court could ignore or dismiss. Mathematical precision of evidence provided sense of closure that violence alone could never achieve, proving justice had been served through careful investigation and legal process rather than mere revenge or vigilante action. What should we do with these items? Leonora asked, holding both seal and concho with appropriate reverence. Keep them as reminders, Hayamovi replied thoughtfully. Not as trophies of victory, but as warnings about what happens when power goes unchecked and good people fail to stand together against tyranny. So future generations will remember justice's cost and freedom's price. Leonora walked to schoolhouse and carefully hung silver concho beside door, where every child would see it daily and learn its story. Below it, she placed simple wooden sign carved by one of local craftsmen, in memory of those who died for water and justice. Cedar Creek, October 1877. Dedication ceremony that followed was unlike anything Willow Springs had ever witnessed, bringing together territorial officials, homesteaders, ranchers, miners, and Cheyenne families in celebration of shared values and common purpose. Judge Morrison spoke briefly about rule of law and its importance in civilized society, while Beatrice read from territorial statutes that would protect their water trust arrangement for generations to come. But the moment everyone would remember came when Hayamovi, wearing his ceremonial bonnet for this important occasion, approached Leonora as she stood beside Spring in her carefully repaired blue dress. White wildflowers crowned her loosened hair in natural wreath, while her hand rested unconsciously on her healed abdomen, gesture of gratitude for recovery and promise of better days ahead. The Cheyenne warrior stopped before her and slowly lowered his forehead until it nearly touched hers, gesture of profound respect and acknowledgement among his people, transcending boundaries of race and culture. His scarred hand remained near, but didn't presume to touch. This was recognition of shared struggle and mutual survival, not possession or romantic attachment. I am here, Leonora said quietly, her words carrying multiple layers of meaning in a crisp autumn air. I hear, Hayamovi replied, using same phrase that had begun their partnership when she first confessed her pain to stranger, who became ally and friend. The crowd dispersed gradually as afternoon shadows began lengthening across Wyoming landscape. But two figures remained by Spring as snow continued falling more heavily from gray sky above. They'd both lost much during their ordeal, family members' comfortable certainties and simpler illusions of easier times when right and wrong seemed more clearly defined. But they'd gained something infinitely more valuable, knowledge that justice was possible. When ordinary people found courage to stand against tyranny and corruption, regardless of personal cost or overwhelming odds they faced. In years to come, children throughout territory would learn story of mail-order bride who became water trustee, Cheyenne warrior who fought for justice rather than revenge, and frontier community that chose cooperation over conflict when faced with choice between law and lawlessness. The tale would grow and change in telling, as such stories always do, but its essential truth would remain. That listening to others' pain, standing against injustice, and working together across all boundaries could overcome even most entrenched corruption and systematic violence. As winter settled over Wyoming territory, with its promise of rest and renewal, Willow Springs faced future with clean water, honest government, and kind of hope that comes from surviving trials that might have destroyed weaker community. The spring would flow freely for generations to come, protected by law and defended by people who understood its true value extended far beyond mere economics or political power. The story that had begun with deception, violence, and desperate fear had ended with truth, justice, and practical cooperation that made civilization possible even in harshest frontier conditions. In the end, it was not the strongest or most ruthless who prevailed, but those who remembered that some things like clean water, honest law, and simple human decency were worth defending no matter the cost.